Hey everybody, welcome back to Terminus, the Terminus Extreme Metal Podcast of Extreme Metal Podcasts. I think we sort of collectively decided that we're done with the AKAs and probably the video game themed podcast names as fun as it is. We're tired. So everybody, welcome back. It's been a while. There's been a personal life and scheduling things going on, but we are back with what I assume will be a very, very important episode to many people out there. Black Metal Guy, have you heard of a band called Bolt Thrower?
Oh man, they were like that was like the first metalcore band, right?
Yeah, I think they're the only good thing that ever came out of Britain. I think Bolt Thrower like justifies the continued existence of the nation.
So I gotta say, I don't really get the anti-British memes. It's I don't understand that. I guess I get that there's a weird way that Americans get. There's a form of, like, obviously, like, NPR person, everything British is better kind of snobbery, which is obviously stupid. Is that where the anti-British jokes come from?
I don't know. I think it depends. I think that people have different experiences with different nationalities. I tend to find certain aspects of, like, the, I don't know, average British personality kind of annoying, but I know that you have more affection for it, so I don't know. It depends on who you interact with, but, everybody's different.
I mean, there's a certain kind of, I definitely know what you mean. There's like English normie culture is like pretty alien in a lot of ways. Like, I think I understand it somewhat, but it's based on being a joiner in ways that are utterly incomprehensible to me.
It's that, and yeah. I think for me, it's like a genuinely misplaced, well, for like internet British people, a genuinely misplaced smugness over like a perceived intellectual superiority that categorically doesn't exist.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, yes, I think the English are slowly realizing that they live in effectively the same state as they're basically in the same political and economic system as America, and slowly waking up to that fact.
They'll get there one day. They'll figure it out. So.
All right, so back to some Britons who are not joiners.
Yeah, leaders, not followers, you might say.
Yes, indeed. The spearhead, as it were.
Yeah. Bolt Thrower obviously rules. We have talked about them many, many times on the show, and we decided that, 5 years into our tenure was about the right time to talk about them directly rather than merely as a reference point for influence to other bands. And, obviously this is not going to be the categorical be-all, end-all episode about Bolt Thrower, because we're just going to be, sort of like with Aberram, we're just going to be covering two records that...
Let's be real, it is going to be the categorical be-all, end-all episode about Bolt Thrower, but we're going to do another one, too, later.
Well, yes, because whatever we say is the categorical be-all, end-all of any point of discussion that we have, but, beyond that, I guess what I'm saying is this is not going to be an all-encompassing analysis of the discography. Yes. We've decided to focus this time on Realm of Chaos and the IVth Crusade, which we're using kind of as proxies for what, at least in my mind, are the two distinct eras of the band's career. Now, obviously, there's a ton of nuance to that, and even further down the line in Bolt Thrower's discography, Those Once Loyal is certainly not merely a retread of the IVth Crusade, but I think broadly we can say that they're organized around two sort of like distinct principles. So we'll get into those individually, but...
And the other thing I would say about them, right, obviously we could call them, like, I think a lot of listeners will know what we mean, but there's the first one with they their sort of raw metalpunk bolt thrower with up-tempo, fair amount of up-tempo passages and blasting, and a kind of the Warhammer influenced and Warhammer-ish aesthetic of the time. Sort of raw, gritty, dark future fantasy bolt thrower. And then there is the side from IVth Crusade onward, which is, how would you characterize it, since that's your baby, really?
Well, I mean, a sort of epic, melodic, somewhat doom-influenced form of death metal, but really I would advance the idea that it is a genre called bolt thrower that is occupied by one band called bolt thrower,
Yeah, so let's get into that in a second. So basically, yes, there's the more polished, epic, doomy bolt thrower, which is based on a focus on certain elements that were already in bolt thrower sound, and maybe an introduction of a couple more. And the hinge between these records, which we're not talking about, and probably will never talk about because we don't need to, is Warmaster. Mm-hmm. Which I would argue is the definitive bolt thrower record. It's basically the moment where they still have the early primordial rawness, but the blasting has been strongly de-emphasized, and the focus is mostly on mid-tempo, the sort of knuckle-dragging mid-tempo grooves and thrash workouts for which they're famous, and a lot of in many ways IVth Crusade does make some additions to that template, but the core of IVth Crusade in this like mid-tempo and lower mid-tempo body music is already central on Warmaster. So it's kind of like the bridge between the two eras.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that is very interesting about bolt thrower's evolution is that something very unusual happens compared to a lot of other metal bands. In the process of developing from raw and more dissonant and chromatic to more melodic and polished, they actually become more minimal and stripped down.
You're right. That's a great point. Yes.
A very, very unusual configuration. Sort of, reversing the polarity of how this stuff typically operates. You're completely right when you say that, like, bolt thrower on the IVth Crusade and onward is present on their earliest material, but I would say it's sort of like making a sculpture. They are chiseling it out of what already exists.
Yes, there's a process of reduction to the essential, and that happens. And that they're really going for that, especially on Warmaster, and then it sort of culminates in IVth Crusade. You can hear that they have burned away everything that they decided was not central to their sound. So yeah, that's a very and the songs actually get. Although the musicianship improves, the songs arguably get less complex. A lot of the songwriting on Realm of Chaos is actually, the riffs themselves are not complex, but a lot of the song structures actually have a lot of different parts, which is something we'll talk about. And yeah, a lot of different parts in a way that connects them maybe to the death metal of the time. But maybe now we could talk more broadly about what you were going to say about how this is a genre that is bolt thrower. Because really, we've said it, this is the death metal guy's line, right? But he's always said, bolt thrower isn't really a death metal band. And the more I thought about that, the more I agreed with him. And it's not really a death metal band, it's something more. Mm-hmm. And we were talking about it the other day, and it's kind of like from bolt thrower, you can get to anywhere in extreme music, and arguably to anywhere in metal, right?
Yes.
Because as you point out, bolt thrower has a lot in common with the earliest heavy metal, new wave of British heavy metal stuff, and that becomes more obvious on their later records, where they let things breathe a little more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that Bolt Thrower has I don't know, there's a fascinating universality to Bolt Thrower, and that's in part due to this like well-studied, rigorous minimalism that allows you to read so much into it. But it's it's the minimalism of something that gestures toward almost anything, and yet not in a broad and diffuse way, in a way that's of a very specific style that the only immediate comparison I could make, in that sense, is to like Celtic Frost, a band that gestures at everything and yet is utterly unique.
Yep, that's a good comparison.
And I think that's also why one thing I do want to get out there is
we come across other bands like that on this show, but they're usually cult. And the funny thing, they're usually there's an obscure kind of band that has an interesting lateral relationship that like has more in common with bands in other genres than its own. But those are often kind of obscure, kind of deservedly or undeservedly. These are often sort of like obscure masterpieces. You could say that about something like, Armored Angel. But what does Armored Angel have a lot in common with?
Bolt Thrower.
Bolt Thrower, right? So, in a way, a lot of these other sui generis bands end up really connected to Bolt Thrower.
Which is why I think that it's also worth saying that, like, I think there is a completely legitimate argument to make for Bolt Thrower being, like, the greatest metal band of all time. I wouldn't personally make that argument, but I think I would say they're probably in the top 5. And if somebody said Bolt Thrower was the greatest metal band of all time, I would listen to their argument. I wouldn't find it absurd.
And before, listeners, you race to find a counterexample, remember the death metal guy saying metal band. So we are comparing, that means you can't just compare it to extreme metal, right? Like you can't, like, there's a bunch of things that we could say might be the greatest extreme metal record of all time. I don't know, like Axis of Advance, Strike, or something, right? Which are clearly not the greatest heavy metal band record of all time, right? So Bolt Thrower sits in a position that straddles both those worlds and captures not just one thing, but many things that are elementally metal.
Yes.
Everyone who hears it will know that's a metal band. And I've said this before about Bolt Thrower. They have one of the wonderful things about them is that Bolt Thrower sounds more like what a normal person thinks death metal sounds like than 99% of death metal.
Yeah. And I think that sort of, this wasn't necessarily my intent when making the statement, but I think an interesting point is brought up, which is, Bolt Thrower sort of perfectly straddles a line between heavy metal and extreme metal in a way that very few bands do. And much like the nature of the Trinity, they are both 100% a heavy metal band and 100% an extreme metal band,
Which you also could say about, you were saying this the other day, but it's like, there's a sequence which you could call the evolution of British extreme music, right? And on one end, there's Motorhead, which is both a heavy metal band and a rock and roll band and an extreme metal band, or extreme hardcore band, extreme punk band. On the one hand, there's one end of that trajectory, there's Motorhead, and on the other hand, there's Bolt Thrower, as these bands that are sort of all-encompassing touchstones that connect to everything through their minimalism. So it's, it's a 10-year period or just a little more from Motorhead to Bolt Thrower, and they kind of bookend it.
And in addition to that, I think that, this has always been in the back of my mind, but it's come into sharper and sharper relief as we've done this show over the years. I'm not sure there is a single extreme metal band that has been more broadly and crucially influential than Bolt Thrower.
Yeah.
I think not merely in terms of sound, but in terms of developing musical techniques, developing a riff lexicon, providing material that could be used in death metal and grindcore and black metal and heavy metal and certain kinds of extreme punk. I don't know. I mean, people could say, people would say, oh, Cannibal Corpse. No, they're just the best selling. Death, no, those were just one of the first. I think Bolt Thrower might be the most influential extreme.
Yeah, name the common denominator between Hate Forest and later Amon Amarth, aside from, I guess, robust European nationalism. And the common denominator is Bolt Thrower.
Yeah, and I think that Bolt Thrower is the common denominator of maybe every metal band that came after them. Is there a metal band that is not influenced by Bolt Thrower?
There's probably a few, but it's a good question.
No, and it's like I bet if you talk to the guys in Mons Veneris right now, they're really into Bolt Thrower.
Yes, well, there's certainly not whether they're conscious, whether it's a major influence or not. I don't think you can find a single. I would really be hard pressed to find a metalhead who does not like Bolt Thrower. There might be people who are like melodic vocals only, please, old school heavy metal stuff, but Bolt Thrower would be the closest they would go to extreme metal. On the other end, I don't know. Yeah, just every black metal guy likes Bolt Thrower. Yeah. They don't necessarily love it. They don't necessarily take it as seriously as things that are less fun, but they should take it seriously. And thanks to Bolt Thrower was immensely influential on the first wave of metalcore, and we're talking about his real 90s metalcore, the hard-edged stuff. Basically, all metalcore after Integrity, which is the first one. All of the serious, gloomy, dramatic, mid-tempo breakdown in centered metalcore is really influenced by Bolt Thrower, pretty much. I mean, and if you go to the next generation of metalcore, the sort of, which we're at the end of, right, the sort of the beatdown of the 20-teens, it's also another return to Bolt Thrower.
The earliest Zabalba stuff clearly owes a ton to Bolt Thrower.
The other bands we talk about, Momentum, Vamachara, Bolt Thrower. And a lot of riffs that you'll hear on the early Bolt Thrower records, if you isolate them, just are modern beatdown hardcore riffs. Yeah. So it's, they really are at the root of a lot of things. If you asked punks or hardcore guys like 10 or 20 years ago, when there was less crossover between the scenes, a lot of them might not have really listened to Bolt Thrower, had no opinion about it. But there was, so I remember there was an inflection point years ago, like in 2015, right? You could go to a random local sort of crusty hardcore show, and you would see a guy who's wearing a Bolt Thrower centered back patch, but it's obviously a punk jacket, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of punk, I will hand it over to you, black metal guy. I know that talking about this sort of thing is always your passion project. It's like when I get to talk about slam or power electronics. Anytime we get to talk about this, I can hear the twinkle in your eye from here.
Okay, so the other reason that Bolt Thrower is not really a death metal band is that Bolt Thrower is the most developed. It is the glorious conclusion of British stenchcore. Bolt Thrower is more a crust punk band than it is a death metal band, based on how those terms worked at the time. And that is why it sounds so different from Altars of Madness or the early Cannibal Corpse, or name your other example of early death metal. And so by stenchcore, we've talked about it before on the show, but we really mean the crust punk can mean a number of things. By stenchcore, we mean the sort of slowly grinding, mid-tempo focused stuff that's inherited from amoebics. So it's ragged, it's chug-driven, it's extremely minimal, and the imagery, unlike that of many of the faster DB crust bands or crustcore bands who sort of clung to a conventional anarcho-punk aesthetic, these other bands were obsessed with medieval barbaric warfare. And it's covered in, everything is covered in swords and axes and ravens and shit, and Celtic knots. And there's a strange confluence of things that happens in, UK stenchcore. And imagery-wise, it has far more to do, in terms of the imagery and the fundamental feeling in it, it has way more to do with second wave black metal than most of what was happening around it. Even though it sounds very different. Amoeba, if the link from amoebics to bolt thrower is certainly there. A certain kind of really primordial bolt thrower riff that you could get on In Battle There Is No Law, their 1988 debut. You can hear riffs there that are certainly like amoebics riffs with blast beats under them, and without, but like a classic bolt thrower riff is just like play the root until the riff is the root note, and then at the end you go bwamp bwamp sliding tritone. That's just that's an amoebics riff, right? So, in fact, for years, I thought that one of these In Battle There Is No Law riffs was an amoebics riff, because I was hearing it in my head in half time. So, there is that, but bolt thrower is really part of the children of amoebics, which is where stenchcore forms as a sort of miniature subculture or whatever, right? So, there's two samples I want to play for you. The first is Deviated Instincts, Disciples of the Storm, from their demo, I think, or it's an EP, rather. It is an EP, 1987. This is January 1987 EP, Welcome to the Orgy. So this is a short sample from Disciples of the Storm.
It's always so aesthetically weird to me whenever I hear this stuff. It's like, I just always think of like building a time machine and going back, and it's like, no guys, like you turn the distortion all the way up and it'll sound like way louder. Why wouldn't you just do that?
I think it sounds great.
I'm not complaining about it. It's like the jism thing,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You think they're using less distortion than a death metal band?
At least it sounds like it, or they haven't like pursued sort of like brick-walled.
Yes, it's not brick-walled.
Yeah, like the compression is so much more intense in metal.
There's a deliberate hollowness to the. There's like the sound is heavy and thick, but also kind of spacious in a way that makes it
it's got that gothy quality.
It gives it it gives it a mystery to it and makes it kind of enveloping. And the also this is a very I will say this is a very old 12-year-old rip. And of course the recording techniques at that time tended to make things sound quiet. So there is a I bet there are better rips of this where it does sound louder, but it will still have the tone quality you're talking about.
Yeah.
I was struck by how quiet it was. I actually turned up my whole volume. But so the thing I want to flag there is the structure. Basically, you start on something that's very close to a blast beat, right? That's sort of this was happening in the U.S. too with Siege, and it was happening in its own way in Germany with Creator. But this is a sort of 1-2 thrashing Slayer beat being pushed to the point that it becomes basically a blast. And then it does something called that this review I'll just call a spill out. Right, the blast ends and it rolls out into this strut rhythm, which is kind of like a two-step, and it's not like metal drumming as we now know it, right? It's much closer to a sparse punk style, like that rudimentary peony thing we were talking about a while ago. But over it, you get a slow, crushing thrash riff that has, I think, can you hear how the riff sounds like Bolt Thrower?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, the sort of curling turnaround, the very basic mix of pentatonic and like thrash metal minor intervals, Phrygian, right? It's and most of all, it's the way the vocals hit there. A constant Bolt Thrower thing will be the hook line that comes in at the end of a passage, like the really cool audible phrase that everyone can hear after the turnaround or just with it, and in this case it's Disciples of the Storm. So you could also hear, I mean, what is basically, it has a little more texture and range to it. It's not as brick-walled, but it is basically a fully fledged death metal vocal in, 1987. So, Deviated Instinct, that's from Welcome to the Orgy. And then 1987 is a big year. At the same time, so that one was recorded in January 87. Now, it's Sacrilege. This is released January 87. So Sacrilege started out as basically a D-beat band. Really good. Their demos are awesome. I own them on record. It's just a good development of D-beat towards something a little more like Slayer. But over time, they slow down, and they acquire the medieval fantasy aesthetic of the stench bands. People talk about them as a thrash band or a crossover band.
Yeah, I feel like that's how I know about them, but that's coming from metal circles. So exactly.
I think they sound basically within the prophecy. The first one, Behind the Realms of Madness, was still pretty fast and was more like ripping metal punk with this kind of D-beat Slayer thing. But by Within the Prophecy, they've significantly slowed down. And everything works at this kind of churning, heavy, crushing mid-tempo for the most part. And I think that's happening under the influence of Amoebics. It starts to work rhythmically way more like that. So they're an interesting example of a band crossing over from one wing of this crust punk scene to another. I want, you could hear the similarities with Deviated Instinct, but check this out. This is from the first track, Sight of the Wise, on Within the Prophecy. And this is a mostly instrumental track, so you'll get to really hear what's going on. and there's the vocal.
See, I think I would actually argue that I think that's a little thrashier than you're giving credit.
Well, this is where I agree with you. I think the reason they get called crossover or thrash is that it is far more like normal thrash than any of the other stench bands.
Well, I think
in part because they're much better musicians, and it sort of obeys some of the songwriting conventions of thrash metal in a way that something like Amoebics or Deviated Instinct just doesn't.
Yeah, and actually the big thing that I really hear, and you mentioned Slayer, certainly, but I think it's like specifically Hell Awaits.
I was going to say Show No Mercy.
Yeah, I mean, but definitely that,
but both of those.
That pre-Rain in Blood Slayer, where they were still, Metallica was still a big part of the DNA, Show No Mercy. Or,
for sure.
Kill 'Em All, excuse me. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's, yes, you're absolutely right. So Sacrilege are really the only of the stench-affiliated bands who are able to effectively bring in Slayer influence, but unlike a lot of other bands a lot of the other bands pushing the envelope at the time, the focus here is on the driving mid-tempo sections of earlier Slayer. And the more sort of legible riffing there, right? And they basically, like, most of this, you can hear at the end, there's, they have some good ripping thrash beats, but the center of gravity on this record is all that sort of churning mid-tempo stuff. Sometimes the songs get lost in it, like, you're just like, okay, the thrash workout's going on a little long. But you could hear, especially at around 3:45, there just is a bolt thrower riff that has the kind of curling, bending flourishes off from the root note that really mark later bolt thrower. Or mark bolt thrower after this.
Yeah, that dun 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 dun. Yeah.
Yeah, dun 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 dun. All of that.
That's actually extremely similar to multiple riffs in Realm of Chaos, and then like slowed down versions of them become like the primary riffing form of later bolt thrower.
Yes. Basically, and the Sacrilege record, like, a lot of it is more just sort of like mid-tempo, kind of indistinct power chord riffing that's not even muted. And, some of that stuff is great, some not so much. But the bolt thrower influence is not, the influence on bolt thrower is not as apparent. It's just in the emphasis. The emphasis is on the crushing mid-tempo stuff. But you get passages like this where it's just like, oh yeah, that's like every bolt thrower riff.
Yeah.
After this. So this is January 1987. Of course, there's a third band in the mix, which you mentioned in your notes, and which many people will be thinking of, which is Napalm Death. And people have, I think. People commonly refer to the first bolt thrower record as grindcore. I'm not sure that's the right term for it, but it's certainly frantic, chaotic punk blast beat music.
So, question, Stench Guru, was Napalm Death ever considered a part of that?
Yeah, I think that's probably the word for what they did before the word was grindcore. I mean, and Napalm Death have talked, right? You mentioned this, right? Because you're interested in Swans and stuff. Napalm Death is like, our earlier stuff was this kind of slowly grinding stuff that was like Swans. I went back and checked out, for this, I checked out Hatred Surge a bit today. That's their 1985 demo.
Yeah, it's bad.
It's bad. B, it's really... A, it's bad. B, the closest thing, it is very, you can hear an obvious connection to something like Swans, and even more so, I'd say Crass, which is why it's bad. But some of the metal riffs are there, and it does have that crushing mid-tempo quality. Yeah, Napalm Death were totally a part of that scene. I think they may have also been calling their own music grindcore, but stenchcore just is another word like that like some guys made, like the Deviated Instinct guys made up to describe their sound. They had put out the Terminal Filth Stenchcore demo. And that actually gets to the chronology here. So the interesting thing is that Napalm Death are really contemporaries of Sacrilege and Deviated Instinct. But I think Deviated Instinct were fully formed a little earlier, because you get Terminal Filth Stenchcore by October 86, and that has the crushing mid-tempo parts, but it really also has blasts, a lot of fast stuff, and you could say that's a grindcore record. So Scum is actually a little bit late to the party in July 1987. And, that's obviously a grind record. But that's interestingly after Bolt Thrower releases the demo for In Battle There Is No Law. So that's the first short, rough version of some of those songs, which is April 87.
Yeah.
So these bands are totally entangled and parts of the same scene.
They were all tight with each other.
Yeah, they were all tight with each other, and basically, Napalm Death are maybe not as seminal as some people realize, even though they were really good, and there's obviously a reason why their music had more staying power and impact than Deviated or Sacrilege, right? But, in some sense, they took longer because they were shedding more, right? They were, like figuring shit out. But they're really contemporaries of those bands and Bolt Thrower, and you can't really say Bolt Thrower is Napalm Death influenced so much as part of that scene. I don't know what else. Basically, 87 is the year of Stench. And there's a great YouTube comment on that Sacrilege record. Someone says, I read somewhere that Napalm Death borrowed the guitar player's effects pedals to get that similar sound on Scum. Clearly the settings aren't exactly the same, but I would say there is definitely a similarity to the thick Sacrilege guitar tone. And some of the coolest parts of Scum actually have that, what you're saying, the non-brick-walled tone.
Yeah.
Some of that strange echoing overtone effects in like the blast parts are really have a similarity to the cavernous boom in the Deviated Instinct sample. So, anyway.
So then...
Yes.
In 1989.
Right, exactly. So, in 1989, there's a little pause, basically, and in 1989, we get Bolt Thrower's Realm of Chaos.
Hey, it's Kari from Sepulchre Curse.
And I'm Jakob.
You're listening to Terminus.
And we are back with the first of our records for tonight, Bolt Thrower's Realm of Chaos, parentheses, Slaves to Darkness, out in 1989 on Earache Records.
Do you always remember this one as Realms of Chaos, like plural?
I do.
Every time. I always do, and I always forget the subtitle.
Yes, well, the subtitle, I wouldn't have noticed if you hadn't written it in the notes. I guess actually to explain the subtitle, that will bring us to the big thing that changed between the big thing that changed between the demo of In Battle There Is No Law and the full length after that, and then Realm of Chaos after, which is that the first edition of Warhammer 40k dropped in October 1987. And the art from the first edition of 40k is the art that gets used on Bolt Thrower's Realm of Chaos. The art is it's a scene that I think by John Blanche, and it's the last stand of a Space Marine Legion called the Imperial Fists. And this gets reused on the Bolt Thrower record. Slaves to Darkness was a very early name in very early Warhammer lore for the Chaos factions. Or a sort of a way of referring to them. I think they were also called Chaos, but they were the Slaves to Darkness. Warhammer has since repurposed that in they're trying to make that come back, which I don't think they need to. But Yeah, basically it's an arcane Warhammer term. And so at this time, you can see that like nobody these days would ever think of like using paying to license IP from a pre-existing thing for their metal record. I don't know. I don't know. You know, this would be its own episode to research. I don't know if 40K, if Warhammer gave it to them free just because they were, you know, sort of just like, hey, this is a sick record. We want to promote ourselves through your record. Of course you can use it. Or whether it was licensed with funds from Earache. But
I think if I recall correctly, it was licensed through funds by Earache, but like pretty cheap, like really cheap. Yeah.
Yes, and this is the important thing, is that either way, Games Workshop hooked it up, and at the time, their entire aesthetic was called heavy metal, and the figurines were made from pewter, from metal. They were in the traditional British toy soldier tradition. The whole visual aesthetic of 40K was and of Warhammer Fantasy was profoundly influenced by metal. The way you get to Warhammer Fantasy is you take Tolkien, you exaggerate everything, and you infuse it with the extremity of 80s British metalpunk. And 40K, you know, you just put that in space and exaggerate everything even more. And the punk tie-ins become more obvious because, of course, you can have sort of like the cyberpunk aesthetic gets incorporated. But at the time, Games Workshop are doing things like putting out metal compilations. I think Sabbath was on one of them, or Sabbath did a song about Khorne, the Chaos God, which was like a special release collab. They were explicitly aligning themselves with the metal scene. And if you look at pictures of some of the major players in Games Workshop back then, it's obvious why. Like old photos of Brian Ansell, the owner of Games Workshop, who spearheaded both Warhammer games, or John Blanche, the sort of visionary artist of the series. These guys both look like metal punks. I have no idea what they identified as, but it's pretty clear from, the spiked out hair or the sort of black jean jackets and sunglasses that what general kind of vibe they were going for. It
was part of the natural cohabitation of like early tabletop gaming and punk and metal, you know.
Yes.
Alongside stuff like D&D. And really what Warhammer did was, just in terms of game design, is they made the war game as we understood it, which previously had been completely simulationist, like hardline calculating logistics during Operation Barbarossa type stuff, gave it a fantasy or sci-fi sheen and simplified the rules considerably to make it accessible to people who would play D&D and things like that. It is very funny to talk about Warhammer 40,000 rules being a simplification of something, but if you get interested in old school like tile and marker wargaming, as I do occasionally, it's much easier. Actually,
actually, this is a good example of the high-low culture collision that is essential to extreme metal and to Warhammer, right? The toy soldier tradition, and with it sort of tabletop military simulation, is as old as Victorian generals and retired admirals. Right? People would even use these sorts of simulations to learn and teach military strategy, and then that gets combined with D&D, and a sort of aggressive, unhinged, drunken spirit. Punk and metal. I imagine these guys were drinking a lot.
Bolt Thrower or Games Workshop?
All of them, man. So, we could talk more about the Warhammer tie-ins, and we will at some point. Maybe it's best to move towards the music now. But that is an essential part of there's a cultural nexus here that I think was incredibly potent. Warhammer has really fallen away from any of the heavy metal aspect. Much to its detriment, I think. I mean, I still love it, but they are ironing all of that out of it. The heavy metal quality of Warhammer figures is part of why my parents wouldn't buy them for me at first. Right? As a kid, I had some beautiful, I had Britain's Knights, beautiful plastic and metal, medieval knights from a classic toy soldier company. I collected those, loved them. But, you walk past the hobby store and you look at the rows on rows, columns and legions of these extremely sinister and angry looking miniatures, and you look at them and it's like, this isn't a toy exactly. And my parents were like, yeah, that's messed up, you can't have those, right? Middle school came around, okay, but like it was definitely metal, and I think I think one of the reasons, my parents wouldn't let me go hang out at the GameStop to play Warhammer because they didn't want me hanging out with older teenagers and dudes in their 20s and ending up as a drunken long-haired dude listening to extreme metal.
And ending up as a guy smoking clove cigarettes outside of a comic book shop at 1 a.m.
Exactly. So, I mean, basically of course, the irony is, the prophecy was they couldn't stave off the prophecy.
It's the story of Oedipus. Everything they did to prevent it just brought it into fruition.
Brought it into reality, right? Basically, the Warhammer is thoroughly heavy metalized, and punk, and that's an important part of it. So, all right. Realm of Chaos. This record, War Master, which is the one after that, is arguably just as good. I might like it just as much. But Realm of Chaos is where Bolt Thrower and Warhammer are totally linked. It comes through in all of the songs, most of the song titles. And it's also where Bolt Thrower has, they've developed towards this emphasis on sort of hypnotic, brutal mid-tempo chug, while, very sort of physical pit music, pit riffs, while also retaining the unhinged rawness of their early stuff. So Realm of Chaos is... you could say that, IVth Crusade is maybe not really a stenchcore record. War Master maybe still is, but Realm of Chaos, it's really apparent.
Yeah.
And the most marked difference is this is the last time they used a lot of blast beats. And I think for anyone who goes back to this record, I think it's one of those records where you will always be surprised by how much their blasting there is and how important the blasting is. I would argue that on this record, the blast parts are actually pretty central. And I think when I was a kid, there was a lot about just getting into, extreme metal. You obviously instantly gravitate toward the big chug parts.
Yeah.
Right? Even when I was mostly a black metal guy at that time, the big chug parts are awesome, and the blasting works there were a lot of kinds of blasting I didn't totally understand at that time. And the blasting here is certainly idiosyncratic and there's very extended passages of it. So I think back in the day, I'd be like, oh yeah, there's some chaotic blasting, and that kind of adds some flavor and changes it up. I go back and listen to it now, and I'm like, hell yeah, I love the blast parts. So we'll try to get into what makes the Bolt Thrower blast special. Death Metal Guy, what's your this was not, so this was almost, I think this was my first Bolt Thrower record, but obviously IVth Crusade was yours. When did Realm of Chaos come into the picture?
So I'm not entirely sure. Bolt Thrower was actually one of the first extreme metal bands I ever heard. And I actually heard them sort of before I got into extreme metal in general. When I was real young, when I was probably 12, occasionally I couldn't sleep, and I had a radio where I would listen to my local K-Rock affiliate, and after midnight on certain days, they would have a segment called The Pit, where they would actually play extreme metal stuff, and I heard a track off of Bolt Thrower's Mercenary. I forget which song, but I heard it and I was like, wow, this is really cool and different from anything I've heard before. This is super heavy. So I sort of filed that away mentally, and I came back to them in a big way when I got into extreme metal later. Now, in terms of Realm of Darkness, I'm not sure when I heard that. You know, this is very early days of file sharing when I'm getting into death and black metal. So getting full-length records wasn't quite as easy, so it might have been like considerably later that I actually heard this record in full. And I think that I was surprised when I heard it, having sort of, grown up on later Bolt Thrower records, just how different it was. So you talked a little bit about the relationship between this band and Stenchcore's relationship with Napalm Death more broadly. And while it's true that they might not be quite as, like, absolutely pioneering as they're made out to be, I think it's hard to deny that Scum and From Enslavement to Obliteration aren't, like, primary influences on this record.
I think, so when is Fido? That's 88?
Yeah,
I think that's
year before this.
Right, so... Yeah, I mean, okay, so you would say that... So, yeah, I guess Scum could also be a primary influence on, the first full-length, judging by the timeline, but only just barely.
I think In Battle is pretty easy to see as contemporary with all these other movements in, like, extreme British metal punk of the time.
Okay.
Realm of Darkness, I feel, is more decisive.
Realm of Chaos.
Realm of Chaos. Slaves to Darkness.
Dude, can we just call it Realms of Chaos? That's the actual name. That's what everyone calls it.
I swear to God, I feel like in real life, everyone calls it Realms.
And it sounds cooler, and I'm pretty sure that's, like, in Warhammer, you refer to the Realms of Chaos.
Yeah.
Because, of course, there's different Chaos gods, and the Warp is a very confusing place.
Okay, so Realms of Chaos. We've decided. It's like, oh, they're not a band anymore. We can do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like on this record, the Napalm Death influence is a lot more immediate and important. Especially because, let me look this up. I can't recall, was In Battle released on Earache?
I doubt it.
It was not. It was released on Vinyl Solution.
Vinyl Solution.
So I think what might have happened is Realm of Chaos is released on Earache. They are then label mates with Napalm Death, and they're coming into much closer contact with one another.
Also Napalm Death blew sort of like Scum sort of blew on. Scum was on Earache, right? And that sort of like blew open the market for this sort of shit. Yeah, right.
I mean, Scum was like one of the first 5 records released on Earache, I believe.
Yeah. So Napalm Death sort of opens the Napalm Death so 87 Napalm Death consolidates their sound and starts this big thing in a way that like Bolt Thrower in 88 and In Battle had not consolidated their sound yet, right? And so Bolt Thrower becomes in the space between the first Bolt Thrower full lengths Napalm Death becomes a more central influence. That would make sense.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that, beyond the general vibe, you can hear it more distinctly in the techniques that Napalm Death sort of pioneered that are... Yeah, people don't talk about, musical technology with regard to grindcore very much. But I think that one thing Napalm Death kind of developed were those extremely fast chromatic power chord riffs, those cut time power chord riffs, that are sort of used to fill space in the way that a blast beat would between more defined and established sort of riff ideas.
So you're saying the sort of the scribbly blast riffs.
Yes. I think that Napalm Death really pioneered that in terms of making it a riffing style in and of itself. Now certainly, certain extreme punk bands, Siege and stuff, had played stuff kind of like that, but it wasn't as fundamental to what the band was as it was for Napalm Death. And you can hear a lot of that here.
Deviated Instinct was doing it. I mean, even in the blast at the beginning of that sample, Bolt Thrower was doing it on In Battle There Is No Law. I think it was already pretty well established. And also on the Sacrilege sample, I was going to point out some of those riffs, when it kicks back into the thrash beat stuff, some of those, if you put a blast under it, would really sound almost exactly like these scribbly blast riffs on Realm of Chaos. On Realms of Chaos. It's there's so many fucking bands we're talking about here, it gets confusing, honestly.
But typically those other bands aren't doing it with that almost nonsense chromaticism that Napalm Death was doing it with.
I don't know. I actually disagree with that. But here's a different thing. I think most of the really fast, blurring riffs that play that role on Realms of Chaos are actually thrash riffs. They're just really, they do have a very arbitrary note choice.
Well, I think you could make an argument that the difference between a certain kind of extreme thrash riff and a grindcore riff is sort of playing ability and tempo. you want less playing ability and a higher tempo, and that's why you can get really interesting blurry stuff on Repulsion's Horrified, which is sort of equally a thrash record and a grindcore record.
Okay, so I see what you mean. I also think, I concede the point about Napalm Death being it has to be a big influence here. I agree with that. We're probably getting a little far.
We're getting a little far
here. Yeah. Basically, whatever we say about the provenance of these riffs, they're important on this record.
Yeah. Well, actually, that's a good segue into the first sample here, which will actually, if I recall correctly, have some distinct examples of what I'm talking about. I just want to play... So I wanted to select a sample that sounds very unlike later Bolt Thrower and one that sounds very like later Bolt Thrower. So the first one, we're actually just going to play the whole song Eternal War. It's just a 2-minute track after the intro to the record, and I think it's funny. From this point forward, Bolt Thrower will never make a song this short ever again. So this is a kind of song that will basically never happen again for Bolt Thrower. I think that this must have been like the first thing they wrote for this record, coming right off the back of In Battle, because it would make so much more sense on that record versus, compared at least to where Bolt Thrower decides to go from here. So as I pointed out while we were listening, that specific, cut time chromatic power chord riff is absolutely a Napalm Death riff.
Yeah, that is a Napalm Death riff. Although this is why I wasn't saying that, because to me that's just a blasted D beat riff. And I would see that as common property of Bolt Thrower and Napalm Death and whatever. But
that's
you're right.
I think that the fact that it's trimmed is different, yeah.
Yeah, the frantically trimmed thing is very characteristically Napalm Death. But the thing after it is much more like a steady thrash riff that's blasted.
Yeah, it was interesting because you said that's more like a thrash riff, and I was thinking that's a lot like a Carcass or a Repulsion riff to me, and they're both correct. Yeah, that's actually
Carcass or
very Repulsion, actually.
Yeah. Also, the other one is the fucking Canadian band Slaughter.
Yeah, yeah.
So so there's something distinctive about that. It's a very well, I'll talk about what I find important about those parts more on my sample, I guess, because there's plenty of examples of that stuff.
And so I also want to point out just these other things. So obviously, blast beats basically don't happen again after Realm of Chaos. I think it's like there's one or two on Warmaster.
There's a few on Warmaster.
Yeah, and then IVth Crusade, they're gone in a very specific, pointed way. Mm-hmm. They are gone. Also, in terms of like leads and soloing, this kind of scribbling Kerry King style chromatic soloing, that disappears completely, which is a little bit disappointing because it does kind of fucking rule here.
It rules, yeah.
But there's no way to make it make sense on where Bolt Thrower ends up.
It doesn't fit in late Bolt Thrower.
No. So, I just think it's so what this really reminds me of, like I said, is the more sophisticated stuff on From Enslavement to Obliteration, which came out, as we said, just a year before this, but it kind of scoops Napalm Death on incorporating more death metal into the sound. It takes Napalm Death another record over with Harmony Corruption in 1990 for that to really come through. Harmony Corruption being a weird record that is like an almost straightforward death metal album before they sort of pull back into more grindy territory again on Utopia Banished. So yeah, I find it really interesting how this is. It's such a cool track, but it bears so little relation to the rest of their career. It's like you have to kind of imagine, the theoretical history where Bolt Thrower stays more on this path and what would have ended up happening.
Yeah, I mean, would have fucking ruled, but possibly if they just did more tracks like Eternal War, right? Basically like a more technical version of the stuff on In Battle There Is No Law, they would not have been. They would probably not be remembered to the same degree. Right?
I think they would have just ended up becoming Nazem or something,
Right. Well, like these days, everyone would put Bolt Thrower on the level of Napalm Death. Whereas if they had continued doing this, I would say a markedly different approach to grinding extreme metal. But if they had continued doing that, they would be more of like, oh, another cool grindcore band from that time.
Yeah.
Right? Would be, yeah. Like, I arguably, like, even if you just isolate it to tracks like this, I arguably like it better than Napalm Death, but it certainly wouldn't have had the same impact.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay, so, yeah, you just very nicely highlighted the blasting stuff, so, and I'm going to get to that on my second sample. Actually, why don't... Okay, No, we'll go through in order. We're going to do Through the Eye of Terror. This is the third track. It comes so we're coming directly off the back of Eternal War. Eternal War almost works as a launcher for this song. Here in the song title, of course, we have a 40K reference. That is, you are passing through the region of space that borders on the warp, right? You're passing through the Eye of Terror into the warp, and into the realms of chaos. Shit's getting really weird. The Geller field is failing. The demons are starting to materialize on your ship, but you can only half see them. It's pretty creepy. And here we start with a bolt thrower riff. Of course, you get rid of the demons by crowd killing them. The ceramite armor of a space marine gives the 10-foot tall friend gives him an extremely powerful crowd kill attack. So basically here, I mean, really between Eternal War versus this. You get a turn from old bolt thrower, right, the earliest bolt thrower, to the new bolt thrower. Through the Eye of Terror, everyone would recognize as, this is bolt thrower. Mm-hmm. And it starts out with a calling card, knuckle-dragging shoggoth of a riff. And the interesting thing is that, to your point, that riff is also a Napalm Death riff. It doesn't really, the slow riff that starts this song does not exactly have the sort of groovy Slayer feel on the Sacrilege stuff or Deviated Instinct stuff. It feels closest to, say, the Siege of Power riff. Some of the strongest moments on Scum, especially if you don't huff glue, are the
well, speak for yourself, buddy.
Yeah. Yeah. Are the thunderous mid-tempo parts, right?
Oh, yeah, I mean, the big riff on the title track is like, that's my go-to warm-up riff pretty much every time I pick up a guitar.
Nice. Yes. So even though everyone remembers it for the blasting, because that was the innovation, they also really put a new inflection on a certain kind of slowed down, exaggerated, and down-tuned thrash riffing. The monstrous thrash riff really gets its start there, unless you count For Whom the Bell Tolls. But so this sort of characteristically bolt thrower riff also has something to do with parts that are on Scum, but that get de-emphasized in Napalm Death, whereas they become emphasized in Bolt Thrower.
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the reasons they become emphasized in Bolt Thrower, and also and sort of like what makes when Bolt Thrower does this sort of thing still different from Napalm Death is that I think it's an almost a personality thing, which is like Bolt Thrower doesn't resent the blues and pub rock in the way that Napalm Death does. You know what I mean? Napalm Death sort of like hate rock music. And that seems like a fundamental part of their DNA from the beginning. Bolt Thrower, I think, are pretty content to like listen to some rock and roll and drink some beers, you know? So the sort of like groovy, occasionally pentatonic stuff, like some of the more boogie-oriented stuff from Motorhead, finds new life in Bolt Thrower where it can't in Napalm Death.
I mean, the blasting riff at the end basically is the riff to Am I Evil played 4 times as fast.
Yeah.
Yes, I hear what you mean. And there's also, I think, a defining characteristic of how they play that's different from Napalm Death is steadiness. Right? When Napalm Death is mid-tempo, they're still not steady. Right? You could say it's driving or aggressive, but Bolt Thrower, you can listen to Bolt Thrower in a very aggressive, moshy way, or you can kind of nod your head, right? You can, as you said, it's the pub rock energy. You could just be sitting at the bar nodding your head, like, all right, man. You can't do that to Siege of Power.
No. Napalm.
And also, it's where the center of gravity is, right? Even though the chug riff on Siege of Power is awesome, everyone knows it's kind of a wind-up to the blasting. And maybe that's part of us, like, listening, like, retro-projecting the rest of Napalm Death's career. So we're like, oh, clearly this record's about the blasting. But, like, it really does work as a wind-up to the blast. And with Bolt Thrower, especially starting from this record and going on, the center of gravity is with the big, thundering, monstrous chug riff.
Yeah, and we'll definitely get to that idea very distinctly a little bit later.
Yes. So, but there's some other stuff to point at here. After that riff, you get an awesome fake out just after the 4-minute mark, maybe 4:10 or 15. They play a new riff that's more overtly sort of pedal point thrashy. It has more of that Slayer feel. And they start out playing it in a rigid and unsyncopated way that if you've just heard Eternal War, you think they're about to blast. You think it's the wind-up for a blast riff. Instead, they totally switch the inflection, so it becomes head-nodding syncopated, and then they drop into another mid-tempo riff. And you could hear that as a signal of intent. You thought we were going to do the blast beats again? Nope. But then, eventually, you do get to some of the fastest, most chaotic blasting on the record. That is a... they head fake you, but then they make you succumb to the inevitable in a really cool way. It's like the torturer not applying the thumb screw the first time. I don't know. You tell me in the comments what the best torture equivalent of the blast beat is. But basically, like, the fast part is important to this song, but not in the way you first expect, and it shows a shift in the center of gravity.
Yeah, and really just emphasizes the shift in the center of gravity of Bolt Thrower from their sort of grind and stench contemporaries. I mean, Stench sort of like...
Well,
in a weird sense, down the road leads toward the Doom Crust stuff, which sort of like realizes what was happening in the background there. But like at least honestly, this came out, you know.
No, honestly, I would say in some way on this record they sound more like a stench band because there is more mid-tempo chug, arguably. That I would say. If you took away the blasting part, it would just sound like a more technical Deviated Instinct or Sacrilege. But I also hear you. It sounds, I mean, something about it overall is somewhat less punky in delivery.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is where you can hear... You know, it's interesting, given that I've read a fair amount...
No, here's the way I'll define it. It's a choice. Before this record, you could confuse them for a grind band because grindcore is emerging from the same scene and they're influenced by grind. But with this record, they end up like basically like there's different parts of the stench formula. Napalm Death develops one part, which is frenetic blasting. Bolt Thrower develops the other, which is the sort of the retarded chug riff. And on this record, they sort of commit to that. And so they're very influenced by Napalm Death here, but I think they're also trying to mark out their own domain.
Well, and that's because, you know, whether they're cognizant of it or not at the time, they've already completed the metamorphosis into an unalloyed heavy metal band, you know. You know, it's always been interesting, you know, reading stuff from, you know, like interviews with the members where they constantly talk about how, like, growing up, you know, they cite all these influences from all these, like, hardcore punk bands and stuff, you know, right before they did In Battle There Is No Law. But it doesn't seem like they were punks. They don't feel like they were part of that scene. It's kind of a strange situation.
Well, I certainly agree that by this time, yeah, like, you know, what you said about, like, you can't really call Scum is not a metal record. Napalm Death would reject that, even though they went on to do metal records. Scum is not a metal record. You know, Terminal Filth Stenchcore is not a metal record by any means. You know, Amoebic certainly is not metal. So this is definitely is. You're right. So there is something that changes here, and maybe it is that, yeah, sort of Napalm Death continue keeping metal at arm's length, even as they embrace things that are more superficially like death metal, while Bolt Thrower become a metal band. Yeah.
So, what do you have next? Before we get to the ultimate statement of intent for the future of Bolt Thrower's soul.
Well, so although the center of gravity is shifting towards slower stuff here, the blasting is still important. And this is not one of the big hit singles, but every time I've listened to this record in the past, in the recent past, I always am like, what's this awesome song? This song rules. And I look it up, it's some song that doesn't even have an obvious Warhammer title. It's Lost Soul's Domain, buried in the middle of the record. And why it's maybe easy to forget about is because, aside from the death metal guy's first sample, this is the most blast-oriented song on the album. However, it does start... so listen to two things here. First of all, it starts off with an absolutely heinous Bolt Thrower riff that could also be like a... really also is so simple. It could be from any of the stench bands we talked about, but could also be from hardcore that came out last year. And then listen to the dynamic here, the thing we heard in Deviated Instinct, the blast that spills out into kind of a strut riff, which is a thing that those rock and roll-ish strut beats will disappear from later Bolt Thrower, but they're very important here.
that actually that has a lot more Morbid Angel energy to it than I remembered.
Dude, fuck! I was gonna talk about that with you.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because it's like it's a bolt thrower. So 89.
Did you see?
What?
Did you see the hint in my notes? I deliberately wrote it down so as not to give it away to you, but you found it on your own.
Oh no, I didn't even. I didn't even notice. It's not coming from Altars because Altars is released the same year. But so Morbid Angel and Bolt Thrower, as I know it, end up touring together like either this year or the next year in the UK and Europe. Like an early, I think that was the Grind Crusher tour. That was like a really important one in 89 or 90. But there's a high likelihood that Bolt Thrower probably heard some of the demos that were getting traded.
Thy Kingdom Come.
Yeah, Thy Kingdom Come, or maybe one of the bootlegs of Abominations of Desolation, that sort of thing, because those were just all over the place at the time. And it's interesting because especially some of those like really spasmodic, that like series of weird, more dissonant riffs, the ones that sound like very sort of oddly un-Bolt Thrower in the middle of that sample, sound very Asymptote, which is pretty interesting.
Oh, you mean like the sort of mid-tempo thrash workout?
No, the faster like slide riffs that
okay,
that sort of thing.
So yeah, okay. So here's what I wanted to do: break that down. We get the first off, I would say the real similarity is the drums, and this is why I always kind of push back on the Napalm Death thing. The kind of blasting Bolt Thrower does is totally different. And it's sloppy enough on In Battle There Is No Law that maybe it's hard to tell, but you can really tell on Realm of Chaos. It's a much steadier blast beat, and in that sense, the emphasis is really on the snare, and there's a legible difference between the snare and the kick. You're not going for that simultaneity. It's not a ripping boop dap boop dap. The emphasis is very downbeat, but it's very downbeat, but it's ducka 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 ducka. And that sort of clarity of the blast and the greater spacing is very Morbid Angel.
Yeah.
It was the Morbid Angel drum, Pete Sandoval.
Yeah.
It's close to a Sandoval blast, although I think they were kind of already doing that on their Bolt Thrower was already kind of doing that on their first record, but here it's clear. It's extremely steady, it's continuous, and so yeah, like in this song also, a modern band doing something like this would have maybe one blast riff that keeps coming back, or maybe two. There are at least 4 blast riffs on this.
Yeah, they're trading them out pretty quick.
Right. So the first one of these riffs is the first blast riff is insane. It basically is kind of a thrash riff, but it can't decide where it starts and where it ends. And the contrast between the raw, sloppy guitar playing and the extremely steady, punctuated drumming, it has that Morbid Angel, he'll end this phrase with a drum roll, right? Every few bars will end with a punctuation mark. Mm-hmm. The difference between the crisp drumming and the frenzied guitar playing is really crucial to the sense of groove here. And when you hear these sort of like this thrash beat where it seems to like this thrash riff seems to start on a different note every time. There's something different about every iteration of it. A feeling I get from this record is that the members of, you've talked about how intuitive Bolt Thrower's learning process was. Mm-hmm. It was very punk, right? They just taught themselves, they started this when they could barely play their instruments. They taught themselves to play by playing Bolt Thrower songs. I think everyone has a slightly different idea of what the riff is.
Yeah.
They might understand the same basic notes that are in it, but they all, whereas another band might be like, okay, this starts a half step before the one, and, it's syncopated, and, it turns around here. even if they don't use that language, right? Even if they just feel it out, bands with like more traditional musicianship, they're on the same page about this stuff. Bolt Thrower are just kind of making it up.
Yeah, no, like even here you can tell. So like the technical standards of, you know, death metal broadly speaking, you know, we're operating in generalities here. The technical standards of death metal between like 87 and 92 would end up being on different planets from one another. This is probably like 89, maybe 90 is about like the last point in time you get away with this sort of thing in the death metal world,
right?
You know?
Right. And what it produces is a really unique groove to it, because it's not like there's no sense of time. They all kind of understand the sense of time, but it's they've Bolt Thrower rehearsed a ton, and they've rehearsed so well that their subtly different ideas of what the melody is mesh. There's a kind of like really intricate anti-musicianship happening here, and it works so well because the drummer creates a very steady grid for them to lock into in their own special ways. So you do that, and then you have the spill out into the strut. Then they have this riff that you were comparing to Azagtote, which I think it is, but it's also just like in Battle There Is No Law riff backwards. It has the tritone slide thing. So this goes. It is like an Azagtote riff, but it's also just a Bolt Thrower riff, I would say. It's a fast Bolt Thrower riff. And then they do and Bolt Thrower actually gets less chromatic over time.
Yes.
I think. And then they do a strut, and then they're back to a thrash riff that might be the first riff, but it's really hard to tell because every time you hear it, it's so different. And then when you think you go to the strut, you end up, right, this thing that is like a vestige of the sort of punk influence. You hear the same riff with a double bass windmill section, right? And it's just heinously heavy. You do a lot of thrash workout, sort of trading sections, and then they bring back one of those riffs that might be the first or third riff and start moving it around the fretboard and changing it up in new ways. And the end of the song is just like, I don't know, 90 seconds? 60 to 90 seconds of sustained droning blasting, followed by one more set of breakdowns. So this song, very much the weight is on the blasting, and the blasting is slower than on some of the other places, than on like Eternal War. It's less grindy. It is This is one reason I don't think there's a huge difference between early and late Bolt Thrower in some ways, is because the blasting is mid-tempo. It can sound frantic and intense, but they're slower blast beats that emphasize this steady, cycling, churning groove. It's kind of like Archgoat, but a little more intricate.
I get what you're saying. I think the thing for me is, and it's actually interesting because after listening to your samples, which are even further than the things that I've chosen from Bolt Thrower's later career, I think that the big thing is just the disappearance of the chromatic quality. Like, it has such a tremendous effect on the music, it almost sounds like a different band. Now, like, the riffs of later Bolt Thrower are present here, but the center of gravity is so much more like evenly distributed between different ideas versus this almost like monomaniacal melodic thing they would end up doing later. It just seems like categorically different to me, which I guess is a great segue into the moment where Bolt Thrower decides what band they're going to be for the rest of their career. Yeah, just play the song. So my super hot take is the moment that these guys wrote the main riff to World Eater, the die was cast and the direction of the band was just decided at that moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think that's a good hypothesis. It's I mean, like, why not? I think, yeah, we'll just accept that as canon.
Yeah, like World Eater is the bolt thrower song. It's really like one of the most defining death metal songs ever. And it really just like, in fact, the shape of this song in general sort of appears to inform the shape of all bolt thrower songs afterward. The sort of like back and forth call and response stuff that's happening with this array of different like chug versus melodic expression riffs, for want of a more artful term. Stuff that's sort of like rooted in thrash breakdown stuff, but with Phrygian phrasing that actually has meaningful melodic information within it.
Yeah, that's the huge change, I think. Yeah, meaningful melodic information. That was what I was struck by listening to this in comparison with the other ones. Because, like, okay, somebody could say, okay, Through the Eye of Terror is really where they hit the bolt thrower formula. But that's then you're just associating it with heavy mid-tempo riffs. The difference is that when they're doing the sort of the Phrygian thrash riffing on the other heavy mid-tempo parts on this record is deliberately interchangeable, right? The slow riffs have a lot in common with the fast, scribbly, chromatic nonsense riffs, in that, like, the choice of notes is purely for heaviness. It's purely to fuel the aggression and drive of the music. They're not really trying to make out standout phrases. And when the phrases stand out, it's because of the particular chug pattern and because of its placement in the song. And the vocal patterns over it. These are like... and the rest of the record is almost anti-development. Certain parts will work together to create heaviness in a hardcore kind of way, where the blasts will throw into the breakdown. But here, you can hear the seeds of a melody sown at the beginning of the song, and then we hear one very clear version of the melody, and then like 6 other versions of the melody as the song goes on. There's all this phrasing. You could say that the other stuff on this record is flowing. Sure, it's flowing. Okay, really, kind of most extreme music is flowing in one way or another, right? But this track is sinuous. It's snaky in a it's far more nimble in terms of the way the melodies develop. There's way more detail in them. And instead of just feeling like thrash metal, it does feel a little bit Eastern authentically, right? It's sort of we're tending more towards curvy sword, but in a good way.
Yeah.
In a way that preserves the tension and idiosyncrasies of these melodies. But yeah, man, there's like this song has like a very deliberate directional development.
Yeah.
Which completely separates it from the other stuff.
And I think I think if somebody out there needed a proof of that, I think it's really this. When I was listening to this record, and got to World Eater, I was like, fuck yeah, World Eater, and I enjoyed it, but something sounded wrong about it, and I couldn't put my finger on it. And then I realized it's because the version of World Eater that I'm most familiar with and I've listened to the most is actually the 1994 re-recording that was for the actually, no, not 94. When was that re-recording? Oh, it was for the Who Dares Wins compilation. Well, no, it was featured on that. When exactly? Okay. So anyway, it was a 94 re-recording. It was for, I guess, an Earache compilation. And the 94 re-recording of World Eater is a little bit slower, seems to be tuned a little lower, and crucially, after they throw into the verse, the blast beat has been replaced with more of a traditional bolt thrower fast double kick run beat, which suggests to me that these guys went back to one of their most defining songs and, in their minds, corrected a deficiency with it. You know, they did not see themselves as a band that did blast beats at that point. There's a deliberate effort to shuck away the lingering grindcore and, by association, punk influence, which is really fascinating to me. And it suggests, again, to me, that if they would go back and re-record, like, possibly their best-known song in such a way as to do that, it must mean that something very conscious happened alongside the writing of this song.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I had no idea about the other version of the song. It's funny, in a way, they turn the song into what the listener expects it will be. Because when I first heard this record, as I told you, you gravitate toward the big chuggy parts. You hear this, you're like, this is the sickest song ever. I love this groovy thrash riff. And then it just goes, and you're like, oh, what the hell? And there's actually a bit of a root note change or key change that happens there. And it I think the first time I heard that, it sounded kind of random, or it was not what I wanted. Now when I listen to it, I love that part. I wouldn't have it any other way. The whole point is that it goes, but like, you know, it's the fucking World Eaters, man. They're tearing apart planets. But I do see why they re-recorded it, because there's so much potential in that first part of the song for a continuous liquid bulldozer groove that they may, you know, it's the reinterpretation seems legitimate to me for sure. I'd actually like to hear it. It's yeah, that seems worth checking out. But at the same time, I do like all the idiosyncrasies of this version. I'll pick the warts and all prototype.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are back with our second bolt-throwing record of the night, with the IVth Crusade coming out in 1992 on Earache Records. And I Black Metal Guy, I think you should just repeat the first line of your notes on this record.
Let's see. I would take a look. This came out in 1992.
It bears repeating that this came out in 1992.
This came out in 1992.
Doesn't it sound like it should be from a decade later or something?
It's insane.
Imagine
right?
this is 3 years after Realm of Chaos.
Right. If I was trying to describe to someone how it sounds, I would say that this is a polished German metalcore record in the vein of Heaven Shall Burn. And now, obviously, Heaven Shall Burn cribbed everything from Bolt Thrower, and especially this era of Bolt Thrower. Yeah. But
except that this came out before the game Doom.
It came out before De Mysteris Dom Satanas. It came out before it came out before Under a Funeral Moon. It came out before In the Nightside Eclipse. It came out before Hordane's Land. It came out before it came out before death metal records 10 times as raw and sloppy. It came out in the same year.
It came out before Covenant.
Yes, it came out in the same. Okay, was Entombed? Was Left Hand Path 1 year before this?
I think that was 91. If I recall,
I'm gonna
correctly.
Guess. Yeah, I'm gonna try for Entombed 91. I think. But Dismember. Okay. Oh no, Left Hand Path, to their credit, I mean, it sucks, but it was from 1990.
That is something I forgot to say on Realm of Darkness. Realm of Darkness, in terms of death metal, most...
You mean Realms of Chaos? Realms of Chaos.
God damn it. Realms of Chaos. Realms of Chaos, in terms of death metal, most closely resembles Swedish death metal, except it came out before all of those records.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, no, I think it resembles Morbid Angel more. I think you get stuff like Sweet Death on Warmaster from 91, because there actually are a few D beats or like Slayer beats on it. Yeah. I think the rhythmic center is just totally different. I think the hardcore scene has conflated Bolt Thrower's tone with the Swedish HM2 tone.
Yeah, that's possible.
Yeah, I think like But what Bolt Thrower is like the superior also ran Scandi retard metal. So like what it's like is Grave or the wait, I'm gonna blank on their name. Unleashed. It's like Grave or Unleashed.
Yeah. Or Demigod.
Right, and we were talking. The other thing, Bolt Thrower really influences Finnish death metal,
yes.
like Demigod. But basically, like, it is crazy how early they are. Yeah,
and it's crazy. The Fourth Crusade, in particular, just feels so insanely ahead of its time. Like if it came out today, it would be an outstanding modern death metal record. It's timeless in a way that very few are. It's like,
I think it'd be an outstanding modern metalcore record. I think Bolt Thrower continues to not be a death metal band.
Yeah, no, I mean that's fair too. Well, I guess what I'm saying is it's interesting how many classic extreme metal records are like classic but clearly rooted in an era. The Fourth Crusade seems entirely unmoored from chronology.
Yeah, because the writing is still, I mean, as you said, they get to this more polished place by removal, right? Mm-hmm. So stylistically, there's no kind of, except for maybe like one or two riffs, like there's one of my favorite riffs on here is a very sort of crushing, mournful doom death or black metal riff that appears towards the end of the title track. That's sick. That's not really like anything else. But like most of the elements here could have existed in 1987. But the production and the songwriting are just so modern.
It's okay. So pulling back. So real quick. Okay, this is the first Bolt Thrower record I ever owned. This is one of the first, like, metal CDs I ever owned. And I have a tattoo of the Eye of Chaos from the back of the CD inlay on my arm. So suffice it to say, I cannot approach this in any objective manner whatsoever. This is just... This is... Of records we've covered on the show, this is up there with, like, Altars of Madness and None So Vile for, like, things I have a personal, like, emotional relationship stretching back to childhood with. Mm-hmm. That being said, this is also, like, the kind of record that can do that. Which is, I think... one of the highest compliments that I can give it. Like, this is a kind of record that you can build an identity around. You know what I mean? Okay, so what's changed? Well, so obviously a ton has been removed, and yet a tremendous amount of room has been generated from that negative space for a few things. One of those big things is melody. Weren't you saying that it was like Gilal from Arghuslent described Bolt Thrower as a melodic death metal band or something?
I think in his promo material for one of the bands that he's released recently, a kind of like Roman Legion themed band. I'm going to forget the name. I honestly keep meaning to check it out. But he, in that material and elsewhere I've seen, they'll just refer to Bolt Thrower in the same breath as things like Armored Angel and a number of other bands as sort of melodic death metal. And you can kind of hear that on Realm of Chaos because of the, certainly with World Eater. And just in general, I guess you could say, okay, it's more melodic than like Altars of Madness, which is just... But not really. You could just be like, oh, there's kind of these flowing, kind of catchy riffs, I guess. But so it wasn't really until I heard Fourth Crusade, and I only sat down and listened to the whole thing for this show, that I was like, oh, wait, this is what Galal's talking about. Right? Yeah. This still has the Bolt Thrower riffs, but now they're real melodies.
Yeah, this certainly is a kind of a melodic death metal record. It's just that the melodies are pretty much exclusively built around Phrygian and Dorian or Aeolian phrases. The other thing is that this is kind of like a doom death record, in a way.
Yes.
And I think this is widely known as sort of like, if you were going to call a Bolt Thrower record doom adjacent, this would be the one. I mean, the opening track, the title track, which actually neither of us sampled, which kind of surprised me. I left that one as like a gimme if you wanted to. That is basically just a powerful, epic doom death song. And yet, despite being from Britain, it really doesn't sound Peaceville. I think you got at something when we were talking during break that it really kind of has more to do with trad doom. There's more like Candlemas and Cathedral in this in its own weird way.
Well, okay, yeah, so that's a complex thing. Basically, if we're talking about the legacy of stenchcore in things, the legacy of the forgotten, siloed genre stenchcore in things that we all recognize, I mean, it is, on the one hand, in Bolt Thrower. It's also, in a different way, in the UK Death Doom. And, of course, also in Godflesh, right? Which, goes back to Napalm Death as well. But but, like, I think it's, there's aspects of the... I would say it doesn't sound like Peaceville Doom. Certainly not the earlier records, right? It doesn't sound like the more deathy... Right, the first My Dying Bride and Paradise Lost records really are slow death metal records. And the riffing is much more recognizably death metal. It is, grinding, chromatic, tremolo, and tremolo chug riffs. This with some more melodic flourishes. But it's part of a moment in the UK that also contains Cathedral, right? Who are much more trad in sound, even though they're death metal on their first record. They have death metal vocals. Also contains Anathema, whose earliest stuff, even though it has death metal vocals, is very doomy. There aren't many proper death metal riffs on it until a little later. And that moment also contains the earliest Solstice record, Lamentations, which is structurally similar in some ways to the Peaceville Doom bands and kind of socially entangled with them, but is way more trad and epic doom. So to me, IVth Crusade sounds of a piece with all of that. It's like if the earlier Bolt Thrower stuff anticipated that world, IVth Crusade exists as part of that moment. And I think it's probably closest to something like Lamentations, which has these kinds of... It has melodic vocals, but otherwise it has this kind of like downcast, flowing, kind of groovy trad doom riffs. So it doesn't exactly sound like Peaceville Doom, but it definitely sounds like UK Death Doom in '92. That's what I'd say.
Yeah, It has the, again, Bolt Thrower touches everything, but doesn't exactly resemble anything out there. And
yes.
What I also find interesting is that Bolt Thrower is extremely influential. This is one of their most revered records, but the most distinct moments on this album really don't sound like anyone else. Some of the novel ideas that are constructed on this, like these sort of like epic, dark, mournful doom passages set against these sort of crushing, palm-muted trem, minor key riffs. Those aren't ideas that have been explored elsewhere. Generally what's been taken from Bolt Thrower is ideas of pacing and rigidity of form, and sort of and minimalism. We can see Bolt Thrower get turned into a band like Ripikolu, who extract certain ideas from the Bolt Thrower sound and build something novel around them. Or we can see it more directly in a comparison to a band we covered early on the show, who I keep going back to, actually, which is Just Before Dawn. a record by the second guitarist, who was only on the first Amon Amarth record, who revealed this bizarre but obviously completely logical connection between Amon Amarth and Bolt Thrower, and made the record that split the difference between the two of them perfectly. It's I don't know, man. This is a special record. Like, this is my favorite Bolt Thrower record, but it also kind of doesn't sound like any of them in its own weird way. Like, it does because it is Bolt Thrower, and Bolt Thrower always sounds like Bolt Thrower, but there are certain things that happen on this album that never happen before or after, and I really appreciate that. Yeah, it fucking rules. You've all heard this album. Fuck you. What have you got for a sample? I think it's just going to be easier to draw out the things that have changed, like, against the music itself.
All right, so interestingly, I think there was an interesting track choice here. Our tracks are... Let's look at our samples. Are these back-to-back? We have Embers, Where Next to Conquer, This Time It's War, and Ritual.
Yeah, we're both...
So, okay, we skipped As the World Burns.
Yeah, we're doing couplets together, though.
Yes.
And we skip the biggest songs on this record, like the IVth Crusade and Spearhead.
Yes, yeah. So basically, Embers is the droniest track on this record. And here's them. Well, let's listen to Embers. From the going backwards of what's remains, the soul shall rise from amongst the flames, from smoldering ruins, the power grows, feel the pulse of fear, as we begin control, from the ashes of the million days. The children of tomorrow now arise. Into the darkness, as emotions slowly fade, memories of the past cannot be saved. Bowing down to face your newfound life. There is no escape, you must comply. This resurrecting hate can be denied.
Man, it's one thing that the rigorous minimalism of this record does is it makes every slight rhythmic variation feel like just like a new breakdown occurring. Like that transition there at the end of that sample, that simple slow gallop riff, that dun 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 dun, and then adjusting it across the time signature so it's one beat and then a little quintuple instead of like a triple stroke, like extending that gallop out completely. It has the effect of like launching a slam or a beatdown passage, but in a completely different motif. It's so interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we're talking about the same thing, but basically when they're doing, obviously the way when that 6/8 riff enters, it's huge. And then they repeat that for quite a while, and then they change it into a dumbed down version of the same riff.
Yeah,
it stays closer to the root.
It goes from a dun 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 to dun 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 dun. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Okay. The chug tightens up, and the number of notes in the turnarounds decrease. It in some sense becomes closer to the stench riffs on the older stuff, but it's this song is, you can really hear on this track a key characteristic of IVth Crusade, which is that they give everything way more time to breathe.
There's a lot of repetition. There's and in a very like black metal way.
Yes, that's another place I was going. Embers is a droney track. At the beginning, they're playing a very dark tremolo riff for 60 seconds, which is a long time in Bolt Thrower. And it's, you don't really get, when there's trem on the earlier stuff, it's in the vein of these fast, grinding, sort of slurring riffs in the sort of Napalm Death vein, or like these fast tremolo pick, basically trem-picked thrash riffs, right, where everyone is not quite sure where the rhythmic emphasis falls. This is just continuous flowing melodic trem from note to note, without a thrashing pedal point pattern, and without the sort of like whiplash buzz sawing up and down of the frantic power chord parts. It's just so this is it is like more normal death metal of that time, for sure. You can hear things like that in Grave, or any number of some of the Swedish bands or whatever, right? But it's also a lot like a scowling, down-tuned black metal riff, and the connection between Bolt Thrower and Hate Forest you can really hear on a track like this.
Yeah. I think it really comes out. These, at first blush, it'll seem like a bizarre parallel, but when I listen to this record, I really think a lot about tracks like Natasha and Eternal Sleep.
Mm-hmm. The trem at the beginning is like crossing the triangle of flame.
Yeah,
in
early
the
dark
Skogenstaden.
Yes. But one thing though that Bolt Thrower does do that's unique, and it's something that occurs across other records, but this record in particular is so droney it really stands out, is the emphasis on continuous streams of palm muted trem riffing.
Yes.
Which is just, like, without open chord punctuation or anything. Mm-hmm. Like, I mean, that's a tremendous amount of time to invest in a purely palm-muted trem line, which is just a really unusual timbral choice you don't see a lot.
Oh, so it was palm muted.
Yeah, that's continuously palm muted.
I thought it was palm muted, then I didn't think it was palm muted because it's like relatively flowing, but yeah, you're right.
It's not like
it's a light mute.
Yeah, it's not a super tight mute. And I think that it's because it's
a light mute on a single string, right?
Yeah, it's a light mute on a single string, and it's interesting because the production is in a very precise place to allow that to work. You know, there's just enough reverb to kind of give you the to make the melodic character of that riff still audible. That's a really tight combination of production and exact playing style, and I think that you don't hear that sort of thing very often. One, because it's hard to voice a riff like that in such a way that it is very audible, and two, because playing long streams of palm-muted trem notes fucking sucks and it hurts.
It's an interesting choice. I mean, long strings of palm-muted trem is a very Slayer thing to do, right? That's like middle of Rain and Blood. And
yeah, but typically there's going to be those like stabs of power chords to sort of like etch out a counterpoint melodic idea.
I think some of them aren't. They're just like pure. Maybe they're not.
I think
they are.
I think Necrophobic has some of what you're talking about. I believe
there are some just like rabid palm muted trem things. Certainly, there's continuous trem without. Certainly, there's continuous trem without sort of thrash punctuation on the middle of Rain and Blood. But I would say that. But anyway, more to the point, I think, with the black metal comparison and the fact that, it's drawn out, it's hypnotic, it's sort of slower, and it's continuously muted. This is a year after Passage to Arcturo and a year before Thy Mighty Contract. So it's actually kind of like a Rotting Christ thing. The band most known for continuous tremolo chug is Rotting Christ, who do it with power chords, so it sounds more chunky, and you can hear there's a percussive quality to the mutes that there's not in this version. But Rotting Christ again is another one of those bands that would really influence GBK and Argoslant. So there's a connection between that was probably, we wouldn't necessarily think to connect Bolt Thrower to Hellenic black metal, but clearly to those guys in Virginia, they were part of the same thing, in a way. That's an interesting thing that I'm just noticing here.
Well, I guess I can say, and all of these are extreme metal bands that are heavily indebted to like 80s heavy metal and rock.
Yes, yeah.
Sort of a unifying feature there, and sort of like secretly with Bolt Thrower, though they don't like proclaim that as an influence. Like
I'm sure Rotting Christ like Bolt Thrower. I mean, Rotting Christ also was clearly really into the Peace-Filled Death.
I meant Bolt Thrower with 80s heavy metal.
Yes, yeah. Okay, the other thing about this song that we need to talk about is, you knew this. I'm not sure I really noticed it at first, but in the YouTube comments, Derek Harrison helpfully points out it has the Cenotaph intro. And another commenter, Vargavind, points out that there's a whole sequence of tracks in this vein, which maybe you knew this, death metal guy.
Yeah.
So it's the outro to In Battle There Is No Law. It's World Eater, Embers, Powder Burns, The Kill Chain, and I guess also Cenotaph. It's basically this track rolls in from nowhere. In a way that Hate Forest songs do later, which is another black metal feature, right? There's an eternal riff, and you just started listening to it.
There's a few chains like this in Bolt Thrower's discography. Like the Cenotaph riff is the biggest one. But then there's also like there's a sequence of numbered tracks that start to emerge, like starting from the IVth Crusade on, or like lyrical references that will like link some of these songs together. I think that Bolt Thrower were a band that were like really comfortable with reusing material or establishing these kinds of leitmotifs across the whole discography, and that's something I just find really charming when bands do that. I think that more bands should do that. I think we should worry less about originality and more to do with like inventing a riff that is entirely their own and then doing variations on it for 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, it goes to show that despite getting profiled as sort of like, meat and potatoes death metal, Bolt Thrower are very deliberate composers who reflect on their own stuff. And more than that, they know their strengths and their writing style. Bolt Thrower heaviness and Bolt Thrower catchiness from the first records onwards is all about context. And so that's an aspect of the quote-unquote grindy songwriting that they keep even here, is their ability to mix and match identical riffs in different contexts.
Yeah. I mean, because they you know, I think these guys
Which is a band, I agree, other bands should do that more. You don't necessarily need there to be a new riff every time, especially not if it's either a leitmotif or just a functional part. You're like, hey, I liked that sawing tritone thing. We need to get from A to B here. Can we do that again? So I was like, yeah, why not? It's not like the main riff of the song.
Yeah, I think these guys... I think...
Oh, wait. Sorry, you go and then I'll go.
I was just going to say, you know, sort of touching on your idea of these guys being, like, very, like, serious composers in a way. I think this is one of those aspects that points to that, and, you know, points to one of the reasons why they have such a powerful legacy, is really when they do stuff like that, they're just sort of accessing traditional modes of music making that have been around for as long as, you know, written music has existed, and the reticence or the shyness to doing stuff like that in a lot of metal bands, or I would say even most metal bands, is really the exception. You know, and like, and that sort of thing puts Bolt Thrower in contact with a musical lineage that's like way longer.
Yeah, jazz, blues, folk music. Yeah. It's right, using a certain lick in different contexts. But also, it means that when they, part of the grinding, like, the interesting thing is that a record like Realms of Chaos is written in this grindy way, this highly modular way. What it means really is that the unit they're thinking of is never just the individual song. The songs are not supposed to be unique, interchangeable. Like, the fact that a part repeats, the fact that they might literally reuse the same riff later on that record, is not an issue, because the individual song is not the fundamental unit. They're also, and maybe more so, composing on the level of the whole album. So you can repeat a riff within a song. Why not repeat it within an album? And that's a style of composition that's much more familiar to us from, like, the hardcore EP or the 20-minute grindcore record. Whereas, like, obviously the way the songs are sequenced is really important. Bolt Thrower gives things more time, draws things out more, allows, writes classic full-length heavy metal albums, but it's like that method is being blown up to the full length, and that is still here on IVth Crusade, and maybe practiced even more deliberately.
Yeah, and I think that I think that with Bolt Thrower, the distinction between albums, from like the IVth Crusade onward, is less to do with like style, which is like pretty concretely established, and more to do with mood, because there are, you know, as you can see with the chain of Cenotaph songs, there are equivalent songs largely across records that are designed to reflect one another, but there's distinctions in delivery and atmosphere and mood that can make these familiar parts work in very different contexts.
Yeah, for sure. Well, with you know, I think when we're thinking about mood, maybe we should move to your next sample where we get some of that sort of scowling doom stuff.
Sure. So Where Next to Conquer is a really fun and weird song. Not both of the ones that I selected are not like extremely I don't know, I'm not going to say well-known, but, like, not largely talked about tracks on this record, but I think that they're awesome. So, overall, Bolt Thrower gets slower on the IVth Crusade and basically stays slower through the rest of their career. That being said, you know, largely because, you know, blast beats disappear. However, there's moments where the pure BPM gets, I think, higher than almost anything previous to it. And this is one of those. So the reduction in tempo overall, what it really does is it allows room for certain rhythmic ideas to breathe where they just would have gotten choked out before. This one opens with a really weird, almost like raga-like rhythm, and then we're going to get into some material that's actually some of the fastest that we've heard thus far in the band's career. Something that I find really interesting about this record and about Bolt Thrower in general is that they do something really well that we usually laud the opposite of on this show, which is they do a lot with the sort of short one-measure riff format, one or two measures. These, on this show, we talk a lot about these, like, very through-composed, elaborate, long, 8-bar riffs, that sort of thing. And I do love that, and I think that it's something that needs to be further explored in extreme metal to, like, really keep things fresh and interesting, is sort of extending the, extending the Overton window of riff shape. But there's something to be said for the deliberate...
Start incorporating slurs into the riff.
Well, I already listen to GBK. It's cool. Yeah. So I think that it's really interesting, though, how Bolt Thrower makes an art over these deliberately shortened riff forms, which might be the last trace of kind of grindcore influence that continues throughout their career. As well as their, like, relative disinterest in kind of classic black or death metal A-B riff formatting. They like this sort of, like, harsh, almost industrial repetition of simple, locked-in phrases.
This is from hardcore.
Yeah,
And
I mean, that's fair.
Yeah. This is, it's D-beat riffing, basically. Like, this is actually a thing you and I will always talk about. You'll be like, and there isn't even a B variation. And I'm like, yeah, needing a B variation means the riff is inferior. It's it should be able to stand alone without it.
I think it's because I'm a person that obsessively writes in A-B variations whenever I pick up a guitar.
I mean, I'm not against A-B variation,
no,
but there's a certain kind of tightness to not having A-B variation. If you can pull it off, if you can make a riff that loops without that and that sets itself up in that way, then you've really you've achieved something, and you've gotten a level of drive that's maybe even greater.
No, I think that's fair, and it definitely promotes this sort of like galvanized marching feel that Bolt Thrower goes for.
Barreling.
Yeah. So something else I want to point out here, which is not something I've talked about a lot pertaining to Bolt Thrower, is the drumming on this song is really fascinating. And I think the drumming in Bolt Thrower grows more interesting after they lose the blast beats, which I think was a decision partially prompted by Andy Whale, their drummer, who had kind of lost interest in drumming in that manner. And here, we can hear certain idiosyncrasies that aren't so common to the rest of death metal. Notice the much faster than usual hi-hat track on this. You know, where most death metal drummers playing at these speeds over double kick lines would be happy to cut those hats in half. This keeps up that sort of punk insistence of the full-time hi-hat playing. I don't know. It's really interesting to hear how he bounces off the sort of unusual rhythmic shapes of some of these Phrygian riffs and makes something more special than is necessary, which really adds to the uniqueness of these songs, I think.
I think another thing that really stands out on this record is obviously earlier Bolt Thrower has very heavy examples of the downbeat thrash beat, taku 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 taku, or taku 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 taku, but more slowed down and under these mid-tempo chug riffs. Here, that sort of rhythm is cranked up to an extreme, so you get very fast, driving, hypnotic version of that riff. They become less headbanging riffs and more like a downbeat equivalent of a Slayer beat or something. And where that goes is less death metal than certain areas of black metal, and especially like war metal. Right?
Oh, I definitely see it as like a pagan black metal thing.
Yes. You get versions of that in pagan black metal for sure. It's possible that there is even Bolt Thrower in Graveland.
I was literally about to say it's like if Capricornus could play drums, he would play that. You know.
Yes.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if someone in Bolt Thrower said this themselves, or if it's just, or somebody else said it, or it's just something I've always connected with. But
wait! My name for it, I forgot. I didn't say that. It's the chariot beat.
Oh, yeah. Well, because I was going to say it really does bring to mind like cavalry galloping.
Yes. It has the sort of the gait, not just like the gait of the horse, but like the hand tense on the reins, and I think the spear or the bronze axe about to descend, right? Yeah.
You know, that first hoof hitting the ground with the most weight, followed by the three behind it in registry with it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's really evocative, and I mean, it is the Bolt Thrower beat. It is the primary rhythmic unit of the band from this point forward.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, so that's cool. We like that.
we like the riff. We like the drum beat. We like the horses. We like the swords.
Do we have more that we need to say about this one? Or?
Nah, man.
I mean, also the title is badass. That's clearly the best title on the record.
Oh, we're next to yeah, that's pretty hard. Yeah.
Yeah. When you're making plans in the group chat.
I guess there is something to say. Actually, pertaining to that title. So Bolt Thrower came out of kind of the peace punk scene, and they did a lot of songs early on about how war was bad, and this is where we start to see we start to see things change a little bit.
Yes.
It seems that on the Fourth Crusade and onward, and especially into later in their career, their feelings on war have changed a little bit. And actually, is this a good time to sort of bring up that link to Warhammer again?
I mean, if we do, we won't go back to the samples for a long time.
Okay,
so
that's fair. We'll save it for the end.
Let's go through the sample. Yeah, we'll talk about the bolt thrower, the metaphysics of war at the end.
Sure.
So this next one, honestly, like, this is a bad song title.
Yeah, this is a terrible song title.
It's like, it's like a pop music title where you use a cliche to launch the song. So track 6, it's This Time It's War. I would say if there's one sort of thing one weakness of this record, it's that often when they take the quintessential bolt thrower melody from those mid-tempo parts that you could hear on Realms of Chaos, that sort of thrash metal minor, Phrygian, slow Slayer riffing, when you take one of those little riff motifs or micro riffs and you let it breathe more as a kind of sprawling Death Doom riff, sometimes they just can't handle the weight that's hung on
they
them.
can't sustain it.
Yeah, I think that's especially true on As the World Burns, but to some degree also even on Fourth Crusade or Icon. Sometimes they do, right? Sometimes it's just austere and majestic. But I think on this track, you're going to get some of these snaky Eastern-sounding riffs played with the density and agility necessary to make them really land and to give them at the beginning of this track, it almost sounds like Melakesh, basically. This part is sick, and this is, to me, absolutely the heaviest song on the record. Oh yeah, I had to sample 3 minutes of that. So there, at the end, it dives back into another one of these more traditionally death metal-y tremolo chug passages. That time on the power chord. But basically, what you get there is from that opening kind of like jump to fuck up section onward. You get every advanced technique in metalcore in a row, with exactly the kind of mosh call signals that become common. And the client, and at first you get basically like, you have the kind of like upper mid-tempo part where those two variations of the curvy sword riff kind of ricochet off each other. And then you drop to the first mid-tempo chug, and then you slow it down further, and you reintroduce some of the melody back into the mid-tempo chug. You do repeat twice, and then you get that awesome doomy tandem guitar part, which signals a new melody, and then you might think we're doing something else, but instead the arcing doom riff becomes the core of the nastiest breakdown yet, which has less chug, it has less double bass, but it's heavier. That is like the real insane windmill part. If you're familiar with beatdown, that is those kind of spacious, sprawling parts are where the weight really is. That's so, it has like that, such a nasty syncopation, whiplash quality to it, in slow motion whiplash. You were also comparing it to South of Heaven, which I think makes sense.
Yeah, South of Heaven and Seasons in the Abyss. Because South of Heaven would have been, 87 or 88, and Seasons of the Abyss is 90. So it's possible that these are like directly referential. Another thing that I really associate this record with, it's weird. I hadn't thought to point out all these sort of latent thrashisms. It especially comes across on my next sample, but I really tie this record to like the prime era of Sepultura a lot. I really associate this with Arise, which is my favorite Sepultura record, which I want to say was like right around 90 also.
I think it's probably older.
Maybe. Can't remember.
Let's see.
Off the top of my head.
I'm looking. No, you're right. 91. Sorry.
91. Okay. Yeah, that's a really interesting record that I think gets a little short shrift because people are either paying attention to Beneath the Remains, which is like the typically considered best Sepultura record, or people are debating the merits of Chaos AD that comes after. But Arise is right in the sweet spot for me. And I think that if you slow down a lot of Arise dramatically, you'd end up with a lot of stuff that kind of sounds like this record. There's a lot of sort of like waning days of thrash records that came out, in like that 90 to 92 time frame that I think are actually excellent. Like some of my favorite thrash records of all time are from that period. And I think a lot of them feed into this in interesting ways.
Yeah. Well, Arise also has the Amoebics reference in the title, and even the album cover is kind of stenchy or Warhammer-y. I keep meaning to listen to this one. I didn't do that much when I was younger, but I'd probably like it.
Oh, it's really cool. That's one of those 10 thrash records I actually listen to. But yeah, no. So obviously this is a standout track, and really just again it points to, at this point, how sophisticated a band Bolt Thrower has become. This is 5 years after the In Battle There Is No Law?
Let's see.
In Battle is 87.
Yeah, that's crazy. Doesn't seem like a lot of time, but it actually is.
This sounds like a band 20 years later, not 5 years. But yeah, this is really the sound of Bolt Thrower coming into their own as actual professional musicians, I would say. And, you know, a lot of the time that signals the death knell of an extreme metal band, but here I think it actually works.
Was that the Devil's Motorcycle?
Possibly. There also sounds like there's a junkie woman screaming down the block, so that's cool too.
Very stench.
Very stench.
All right, let's go.
All right. So one more from me. This is really just an I like the riff one. This is Ritual. It opens with actually one of my favorite Bolt Thrower riffs of all time. Mostly, I don't know. Partly because it's just kind of different. It's a strictly pentatonic riff, which is increasingly rare for them as their career continues. And it's shaped uniquely, but like, I don't know, inherently recognizable and familiar in a way that's very satisfying. And I think that it's also cool how this, to me, sounds the closest to old Bolt Thrower that they ever get on this record. Like, you can hear them debating, well, maybe we can just do, like, one blast beat as a little treat just on this one. Well, Black Metal Guy got it right. It's just the world's heaviest Pantera riff that opens this song.
Yeah, and we were talking about, like, what makes it better than a Pantera riff, and we agree it's that halfway through the riff, you get this double-time trem chug run.
Yeah, that dun 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 dun. dun 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 dun. Fuck yeah, dude.
The other thing is that it has an A-B structure, but the A and the B turnarounds are totally different.
Yeah, it's
so it's really not an A-B riff in a way.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's sort of like not really a bolt thrower riff in a way. It's like pretty different from most of all the rest of their material, and I think that's why it's so satisfying. Like a whole album full of chuggy pentatonic riffs like that would be awful, but whipping one out every few songs like that is a really satisfying thing, and again keeps it in contact with Motorhead and sort of like pub rock stuff in a way that I just find uniquely satisfying here.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, I love the speed on this. This is also, yes, it really does almost get to a blast beat. The first time it really speeds up, it's very confusing to the ear. It sounds like they're doing a double pedal with a 1-2 Slayer beat, so the emphasis is on the upbeat. So it's like a running rhythm. Boop da boop da boop da boop da boop da boop da. But I'm not sure. It's hard to tell. The second time they play it, it's clearly on the downbeat, and you realize that like there's this huge grace note that they use, and the grace note's actually 2 notes. So once you realize that, it sort of resolves into a downbeat pattern. But I'm legitimately not sure whether the first one works that way, or just because of how it's set up, it sounds ambiguous. But basically, this is an example of bolt thrower at their most polished, basically deliberately doing the kind of rhythmically ambiguous writing they did on the chaotic trem riffs on Realms of Chaos.
Yeah, no, and I think that really has something to do with, like, I pointed this out in the notes and I haven't really brought it up, but the intimacy of this band, the fact that it was a largely unchanged lineup throughout its history, apart from the drummer getting swapped out about halfway through the discography. These are people that knew each other extremely well. Joe Bench and Gavin Ward were like in a long-term relationship before joining the band together, and then at some point broke up, and they just kept at it in the band, and it doesn't seem like there was ever like any discussion about either one of them leaving. They were just going to keep going. And so those sorts of relationships and just the sheer amount of time practicing, this sounds like a band that's like made up of good, not great musicians, but ones that have just played for an unfathomable number of hours together. I think that allows for idiosyncrasies like that weird little sort of rhythmic interrupter that you're referring to, that would be very difficult for other people, but come very naturally to them.
Yeah, because and here, like earlier, they were doing this kind of as a function of their the sort of everyone was off from each other in a way that synced up. Here, they're all really on together, and yet they're still the band is really tight here, but they are still doing that kind of stuff. Anyway, I don't really have anything to add to what you said. I was just repeating it.
That's fine. No,
anyway.
Yeah, it's album good, band good. All right, but in the grim darkness of the future, we need to talk about that. So, circling back to what we were hinting at in the middle of the review, bolt thrower is often championed as a sincerely anti-war band with genuine leftist priors, in contrast to a lot of other stuff in extreme metal. But the interesting thing about that is that while they consistently throughout their career insisted on this ideologically, it doesn't really seem to bear out in their discography, especially with like progressive transformation that occurred. And I'd like to point to the outro of the Fourth Crusade as like a really big turning point on that. So earlier bolt thrower songs will have some like fairly strident stuff about, you know, the horrors of war and man's inhumanity to man, etc. But the outro to the Fourth Crusade, titled Through the Ages, features Carl Willits just sort of delivering a spoken word passage against an instrumental, just reciting the dates and locations of various wars that simply concludes with the lines, "Mankind's destructive nature throughout the ages." So, if earlier bolt thrower is pretty clearly anti-war, and here we're at a point of sort of cold, resolute neutrality, what I find especially interesting is that as their career progresses, by the time we get to Those Once Loyal is basically just a hagiography of just the mighty deeds of proud and loyal soldiers.
I mean, there's a fucking record called what? Honor, Valor, Pride.
Yeah. So I find it fascinating.
I mean, isn't that by a Finnish band? Yeah, that came out after Up for Blood, right? It's not even in print anymore.
I find it really interesting. I don't think that it's really like cognitive dissonance on the part of the band. I think the guys in both are always kind of like meant something different by their stance on war than what other people projected onto it, but I do find it interesting that a lot of people have basically ignored the fact that the way they spoke about war and violence changed substantially over the course of their career.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think the context for this band is stenchcore or crust punk cognitive dissonance about violence, which we've talked about before. But yeah, even if you like, basically, if you follow it back, you find an interesting juxtaposition of statements that are like the ones you just made, man's eternal nature, right? This kind of acknowledgement of violence and war as simply a part of life, reality. You can find statements like that as far back as you go, awkwardly juxtaposed with sort of peace punk stuff, as if to kind of offset the other stuff. So if you go to like in Realm of Chaos, if we look at Eternal War, most of the song is familiar crust punk tropes. Those in power, rotten to the core, the ongoing battle of the Eternal War. What are you fighting for? Is it worth dying for? You're held by your chains, blah, blah, blah. Right, we all know that one. And except the first two lines are, through man's existence, from the start of time, the fight for survival is our only crime. Which seems to be excusing it. As in, your only crime is the fight for survival, right? The natural state of existence is a fight for survival, which man has moralized as crime. And these, of course, there's a way of attempting to square this circle, right? Bolt Thrower has this image of, the struggle against those in power, right? So we are, and that takes us back to the sort of the familiar tropes of crust punk. Basically, like hardcore punk and sort of the D-beat crust tradition from the UK and Europe is extremely violent music, sonically. But the interesting paradox is that it's linked to a pacifist politics. And what you get here is the fantasy of violence against itself, right? Violence, we have the glory and heroism of violence against oppression, against sort of hierarchical top-down violence. So violence, and the goal is to produce a state beyond violence, right? A state of peace, harmony, cooperation, mutual aid.
It's the standard bizarre, like, tortured psychological mechanism in which people want to conduct righteous violence, but the righteousness is actually just an excuse for the violence that they want. It's the it's the fantasy of throwing the second punch, you know.
Yes, it's the fantasy of throwing the second punch, and you got there ahead of me, but that's obviously what's going on in this music, is that people are attracted to the romance of violence, and there's a moral narrative superimposed on it. You know, obviously some people come to crust punk really because they are sort of, Crass themselves literally were older hippies trying to ideologically capture a nebulous early punk scene. Mm-hmm. They basically just said that. The guy who ran Maximum Rock and Roll in the U.S. said, "I am a Trotskyist activist attempting to ideologically steer the scene in a positive direction." He just said it.
I admire the straightforwardness of it, honestly.
Yes, he was very straightforward and not a dumb guy. Maximum Rock and Roll actually, had some great writing about music, but but basically, clearly, for a lot of people, the appeal of this music is throwing bricks at cops or fantasizing about throwing bricks at cops. And the, and this is as old as the romance of the French Revolution or the Communist Revolution, right? The Che Guevara cap. And the idea of, if an oppressive class structure and economic alienation is a kind of negation of essential human freedom, violence is the negation of the negation. And of course, it's all oriented towards this future utopia. So that's the classic punk narrative about violence. And that's the starting point for bands like IVth. IVth, of course, is its own episode, but basically you can see IVth and the stench bands following them taking this sort of interesting approach where the band of freedom fighters becomes something much more like a barbarian tribe. And the idea of the morally instrumentalized violence, right? Violence as a means to implementing a moral order, violence as a means to a just end, starts to become something more like a traditional notion of the heroic virtue of violence, and starts to be more like a warrior culture rather than a revolutionary culture. And you can really see this if you go back to the first Bolt Thrower record, you can see it. So most of the track In Battle There Is No Law is anti-war lyrics. But again, in the fight for existence and life, there is no law. And in the presence of eternal death, there is no law. And as the struggle for power and domination prevails, in the arising slaughter, it shall be every man for himself, as in battle there is no law.
Are these Axis of Advance lyrics?
Yeah, these are Axis of Advance lyrics, right? This is, basically, the morally instrumentalized version is, we need violence to implement the law. We need violence against the oppressive current law, the oppressive liberal capitalist law, to implement the true moral law, which I guess is anarchy, of course. And anarchy is, you do everything that the liberal or Leninist state wants to do, except you do it without any coercive structures. Yeah. It's a perfect synthesis of everything about liberalism and communism, and there's no state and no coercion.
Listen, Dad, I'll clean up my room, but not because you're telling me to.
Right. Yes, you'll clean up your own room out of the principle of your own freedom. So basically, violence is in the crass mentality, or the post crass themselves would have said they were pacifists, but in the sort of revolutionary crust punk tradition, you are trying to go to war of a kind in order to achieve a quote unquote lawless anarchic situation, right? Which is peaceful and harmonious, and where a moral law of justice is implemented. But Bolt Thrower look at this and say, no, the anarchy is the violence. In battle, there is no law. If you want to look for a place where there is anarchy, where there is no law, it's actually the fighting. Mm-hmm. Which is very similar to what Jisms say. Anarchy, violence, punks is hippies. Jism, another band that has been
for the pussyfooters.
Yes. And so if you're identifying violence not as a means to freedom, but as the practice of a kind of radical freedom, what does that mean? Right? It's violence as the exertion of pure force in a world of bodies and forces and primordial loyalties to your little tribe of barbarian warriors, which is quite different from the other punk rock vision. It's the right, and so you get the sort of the violent self-assertion of the independent barbarian war band it's how they preserve and manifest their independence and their survival. You see this in Amoebics too, and whatever, and it has a link to the tradition of Saxon liberty, or the notion of the Celtic barbarian standing up against the Roman and Saxon. It's very English and British more generally. Amoebics would always insist they were British; they identified with the Celt. But yeah, there's a real shift. If you get basically, when you say in battle there is no law, the law you're talking about is not the oppressive law of the state. It's the Abrahamic moral law. It's liberty and justice. And the person who says that is recognizing that kind of anarchist, the absolute anarchist, who doesn't believe there's a state of affairs you're trying to realize, a harmonious state of affairs, but who just believes in maintaining your freehold against all comers, right? Who just believes in the practical exercise of force to maintain freedom. That person recognizes the same metaphysical truth as the monarchist. And if you start with a society of independent, self-assertive barbarians living in sort of voluntaristic communities, you end up with an aristocracy and a monarchy. That is just the story of the Dark Ages. You can read, so Bolt Thrower is really on the cusp between two ways of thinking, and over the course of the course of their career, they move towards the second one. And in this respect, there's a similarity, I think the death metal guy was pointing out, to Warhammer.
Yeah. I mean, Warhammer is... you and I have talked about it many times. You're more into the Warhammer lore than I am, but I know enough to get around. Sure. I'm not fluent, but I could order in a Warhammer restaurant. Phrased simply and much less historically informed than yours. The problem with Warhammer trying to strip itself of all of its problematic elements is that Warhammer is inherently problematic elements. Because, as we were discussing, I sort of adhere to the idea that there is no functional way, in most cases, to make anti-war media. I think that war and violence more broadly is of an inherent interest to a large amount of the population, the idea of, exercising power and force and will upon others without necessarily their consent or enjoyment is
and of course also courage in the face of mortal danger, sacrifice, all that.
Yes, of course. All these.
But that's not the part that bothers anyone.
well,
Yeah.
I mean, I could get into it at some point, but I think that it's like I do not believe that these virtuous or sort of condemning adjectives that we apply to acts of violence are referring to anything different. They're
No, I get what you mean.
These are
Yes.
moralistic inflections that we place upon acts of violence. So you can be into courage or you can be into sadism, but what you're really into is violence, and everything else is just commentary on the fact.
No, that's true for sure. The main point is the exercise of force, which is power over others, or exercise of force on others.
And Warhammer, Warhammer has always existed in this sort of like nebulous area where it's like, it was deliberately over the top, a little bit comical in certain ways. A lot of people refer to Warhammer as a satire, except they couldn't tell you that it's a satire of like anything in particular. It's like there isn't such a thing as a parody or a satire without something that it is mocking. So I don't think that really works.
There's a specific chronology here that I can give.
Yeah, you would know better than me.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I love what you said about this. It's, what you said about, I think you used this phrase the other day, how war glorifies itself.
Yeah, I think I'm stealing that from someone, but yeah.
Yeah, and you could say that that's true in general, and it's especially true in the case of something like Warhammer or Bolt Thrower, which just makes the war it's about seem manifestly extremely cool.
Yeah.
But basically, first edition Warhammer was highly informed by sort of stuff like Judge Dredd, like 80s punk comics stuff. And and it was sillier than following Warhammer. It was like more silly. And it did have this kind of the Judge Dredd quality of poking fun at a sort of future fascist authoritarian order, which was supposed to be dystopian. The problem is, of course, Judge Dredd made Judge Dredd really cool, right? Judge Dredd was supposed to be the ultimate parody of like that murderous asshole cop who's like judge, jury, and executioner. But the problem is he has a really cool helmet and he fights the bad guys.
And really, I think, moreover, that Judge Dredd has no pretense about it.
Yeah.
It's like the murderous cop is actually okay as long as he is just openly a murderous cop rather than
right. He's not pretending, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, that's a shift. I mean, that's one thing extreme metal does, and it's one thing Warhammer does, and whatever is the removal of certain it's the removal of a pretense of justice from force.
Yes.
Which is which goes back to the way that it departs from, the corrupt cop paradigm, right? The exerciser of force pretending to be, something that he's not, and also to the punk thinking that he's a liberator. But basically, like, there is more overt parody and satire, more overt satire in the first edition of Warhammer, but it drops away real quick in second edition. And that's partly because of shifts from first to second edition. It's partly because they just make the Emperor and the Space Marines so damn cool, right? And it's also because people, like, 40K has way more to do with Warhammer Fantasy than I think a lot of people acknowledge. And Warhammer Fantasy is not a parody in any way. What it is it's exaggerated and metal and dark. And even in Warhammer Fantasy, the crucial thing about this franchise is that there is not a good and evil distinction, fundamentally. Warhammer, whether it's fantasy or 40k, is beyond good and evil. It is about the contest of primordial forces. That is apparent from the opposition that's central to fantasy and 40k is order versus chaos. And that's specifically not good versus evil, right? The whole point was, this has become, Games Workshop has attempted to sort of fuck this up over time, but the whole point at the beginning was chaos was like cool, right? The whole point about the Chaos faction was that they were kind of an analog to this notion of the barbarian crust punk warrior. And they were... The Chaos factions is kind of like if the goat men on the front of a war metal album came to life and invaded the world. You certainly wouldn't want to live in a reality created by them, but you'd have to admit they were pretty cool. Right? Chaos is like the goat men, or like, like hentai entities with machine guns or whatever. You'd be like, well, that is pretty cool. And the characteristic thing about chaos isn't that it's so much, the chaos societies are, like the order societies, hierarchical, militaristic, violent, and whatever, right? The reason one might not prefer order to chaos, well, the whole point is that chaos is cool, but it's unhealthy, right? You can't, it's sort of vital forces of aggression and lust, and knowledge questing, and even sort of its vital force turned back on itself or carried to such an extreme that it becomes sort of highly entropic, right? Like, Nurgle is plague and decay, but plague and decay is a part of life. You just wouldn't want it to become the whole thing. And the real difference, of course, is just that the good guys or the quote-unquote good guys, the Order faction, right? They're trying to sustain life and a world where a normal person can own a farm. But, what would attract you to the good guys in that context when chaos is so cool? What would attract you to Order is not the fact that Order is... They're not like... they're not even sort of... they're not struggling for anything like a modern moral order. Right? These are hierarchical cultures that are, have a strong in-group preference, are constantly warring with each other, and are extremely militarized. But what would attract you to them is just that they're your guys, right? You see, right? You see the Empire, and you're like, oh, fuck, I played with Knight, I had Knight toys as a kid. That's sick. These are my guys. Oh, I'm from Germany. That's like the Empire. These are my guys. I'm from England. I love the Bretonians, right? Or, whatever. There's a sort of primordial, instinctive loyalty and affiliation there that happens, which is how actual loyalty works in our world, and which is very different from having a moral schema for how to create a harmonious world. So Warhammer is founded on the assumption that in battle there is no law.
Tonkin, beware!